Welcome to the introduction to the New Testament. Before going on to the New Testament introduction proper, I've got a series of articles for you that I've collated from various sources in order that we understand the Jewish religion in New Testament times. I hope you find it helpful and interesting. We will take a look at Jesus and the Old Testament, the Passover and Last Supper, which is written by a Jewish Christian woman, and various other bits of information that set the scene for the times in which Jesus was born and had his ministry, and of course died and was risen from the grave and his ascension. But all these, there are later introductions for when we come to studying the Gospels and the Acts. So then, introduction to the New Testament and the New Testament times, which were shaped, like all history, by the previous political, economic and spiritual upheavals that came before. And I begin by saying that I am aware that Jews today consider it an insult to speak of the Old Testament, and I hereby declare that I mean no insult. Jesus was a Jew, and the scriptures to which he referred to before the New Testament were written were, of course, the entire Hebrew Bible. I use Old and New Testament here for purposes of ease, and as Christians because we take the entire Hebrew Bible along with our New Testament as the one book. Many thanks. Jesus was a Jew. The Christian church began its life in Palestine, and its first members were Jews. To understand the New Testament, we need to have some knowledge of the Jewish religion as it was in and around the time of Jesus. The last of the Old Testament prophets lived 400 years or more before John the Baptist came on the scene. Since that time, the Jewish religion had not stood still. The classical religion of Old Testament Israel had evolved into Judaism. By the 1st century AD, Jews were to be found all over the Roman world and beyond. Here, we focus on the Jews of Palestine. Some important institutions in Judaism. The Temple. Solomon's great temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC. After the exile, the Jews who returned to Jerusalem built a less impressive structure, which lasted for 500 years. Then Herod the Great decided to replace it with a magnificent new temple, which became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was begun in 19 BC and was still not complete in the time of Jesus. See John chapter 2 verse 20. It was finished eventually in AD 64, 6 years before it was destroyed by the Romans. It was this imposing complex of buildings which excited the admiration of Jesus' disciples. Mark 13:1. Here the age-old ritual of sacrifice and worship continued with its elaborate establishment of priests and temple servants, though all under the watchful eye of the Roman garrison in the fortress of Antonia, which overlooked its courts. See Acts 21, verse 31. The temple buildings proper were separated off from the vast outer courtyard, the court of the Gentiles, by a barrier which bore notices forbidding any Gentile to enter on pain of death. See Acts 21, verses 28 to 29, and Ephesians 2, chapter 14. When the Gospels describe Jesus as teaching and carrying out his work in the temple. It was usually in this wide public area where teachers had set up their stands in the shaded porticos, and people would gather to listen and ask questions. Here too, at festival times, was the thriving market in sacrificial animals and sacred money for the temple offerings, which so angered Jesus. The temple was not merely a place of worship, it was a symbol of Jewish identity and national pride. One of the chief reasons why Jesus and his followers became unpopular was that they were perceived as anti-temple. See Matthew 26:61, Matthew 27:40, and Acts 6, chapters 13 to 14. The synagogue. There was only one temple, but each community had its synagogue. Here there was no sacrifice. It was the local centre for worship and study of the law. On the Sabbath, the community would meet, men and women separated, to listen to the reading and exposition of set passages from the law and the prophets, see Luke 4:16 and onwards, and to join in liturgical prayers. During the week, the synagogue was the local school, the community centre, and the focus of local government. Its elders were the civil authorities of the community, the magistrates and guardians of public morals. Law and traditions. Israel had had a law since the days of Moses, but after the exile and the destruction of the temple, Ezra, in the 5th century BC, led a movement of intensive study of the law, and the Jews became increasingly the people of the book. This detailed study gave rise to a body of traditions still developing in the time of Jesus, which aimed to spell out more fully how the law should be followed. Scribes, professional students and guardians of the law and traditions, worked out exact regulations for all occasions. There were, for example, 39 types of action prohibited on the Sabbath, and one of those, taking anything from one place to another, lent itself to further elaboration sufficient to cover almost any activity. Travel was limited to a Sabbath day's journey, which was about 2/3 of a mile. See Acts 1 verse 12. Scribal teaching was meant to help people to keep the law, but sadly Jesus' comments on the scribes shows that sometimes concern with details overshadowed the more fundamental concerns of the law. See Mark 7, 1 to 13 and Matthew 23:23. The marks of a Jew. The survival of the Jews in the face of hostility and persecution led them to prize those aspects of the law which marked them out as the people of God. 3 identity markers became especially important: circumcision, the keeping of the Sabbath, and the food laws based on Leviticus 11 and on the command not to eat blood, which made it impossible for Jews to share normal meals with non-Jews. One of the biggest problems faced by the early Christians was how Jewish and non-Jewish believers could be integrated into one community. Read Acts 10 verses 1 to 11, 18, Acts 15 verses 1 to 29. That's Acts chapter 10 verse 1 to 11, 18. Chapter 10 verse 1 to 11, 18. Parties and movements in 1st century Judaism. The Pharisees. Readers of the Gospels tend to think of the Pharisees as self-righteous hypocrites, but this is not the way most Jews at the time saw them. They were the religious purists, enthusiastically committed to preserving and obeying the law and keen to encourage others to do so. Judged by this standard, they were model Jews. See Philippians 3, verses 5 to 6. and they were widely respected. Most scribes belonged to the Pharisaic party, and from them came the rich development of legal traditions already mentioned. Their concern for meticulous legal observance, particularly over matters of ritual purity in food, limited their social contact with less scrupulous Jews and could lead to a sense of superiority over the people of the land. See John 7:49. This separation and their tendency to place a higher value on precise ritual observance than on such broad principles as love and mercy led them into conflict with Jesus. He did not dispute their orthodoxy, but accused them of getting the service of God out of perspective, so that their well-meant attempts to define the requirements of the law actually made things more difficult for ordinary people, the laity. The number of Pharisees was probably not very great, but their influence was strong. It was the Pharisees who worked out the lines along which Judaism developed after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. They ensured a continued emphasis on individual piety and strict ethic standards, as well as ritual observance. The Sadducees. The Sadducees were the other main party at the time of Jesus, though their influence was already declining. They were drawn from the rich, landowning families. The chief priests were mainly Sadducees, and it was from among their ranks that the high priest was chosen. They controlled the organization of the temple and were still the dominant party in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Council, where they and the Pharisees frequently took opposite positions. See Acts 23, 6-10. Their religious stance was conservative, accepting no revelation beyond the 5 books of Moses, which is Genesis to Deuteronomy. So they rejected more recent beliefs favoured by the Pharisees, such as immortality, resurrection, angels and demons. See Mark 12:18 and Acts 23:8. As an aristocratic minority, they did not enjoy as much popular support as the Pharisees. The Essenes, this previously rather shadowy group, had come dramatically to light since 1947 with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These ancient scrolls are from the library of the Qumran community, a monastic sect of the Essenes who lived in deliberate isolation in the barren desert near the Dead Sea. The sect was founded by the otherwise unknown teacher of righteousness about 165 BC and survived until AD 68, when it was destroyed in the Jewish revolt against the Romans. They saw themselves as the true people of God, and other Jews, including the temple establishment in Jerusalem, as his enemies. Out there in the desert they waited for the coming of the Messiah, the priestly Messiah of Aaron and the royal Messiah of Israel, and the great final battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, when God would vindicate their faithful witness and restore the true sanctuary. Meanwhile, they were occupied in the diligent study of the Scriptures, bound by a strict monastic discipline, keeping the law more rigorously even than the Pharisees, loving one another and hating those outside. They produced elaborate biblical commentaries, applying every phrase of the Old Testament passages to their own situation and expectations. Not all Essene groups shared the separatist lifestyle of Qumran, but the documents from Qumran give vivid evidence of an ascetic, apocalyptic type of Judaism, which was very much alive as a real alternative to the better-known Pharisees and Sadducees. The Zealots. Whilst Pharisees and Sadducees tried to make the best of Roman rule, the men of Qumran dreamed of God's mighty intervention in the future. Many Jews were not prepared to wait. A serious revolt led by Judas of Galilee when the Roman poll tax was introduced in AD 6, see Acts 5:37, was the inspiration for the later groups of freedom fighters, often lumped together under the banner Zealots. The Barabbas, who was a prisoner at the time of Jesus' trial, probably led one such group. The Romans suppressed several earlier uprisings, but the great Jewish revolt, provoked by the Zealots in AD 66, led to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. At their best, Zealots were religiously motivated patriots, believing that the people of God should not be subject to a foreign empire. Apocalyptic. Many apocalypses, otherwise known as revelations, were written in Palestine from the 2nd century BC onwards to offer a message of hope to a people near despair. They recount extraordinary visions allegedly received by great men of the past, Enoch, Elijah, Ezra, etc., usually in cryptic imagery, with symbolic numbers and carefully calculated dates. They are marked by a strong dualism, good and evil, God and Satan, light and darkness, are involved in cosmic conflict. The present world order is controlled by the forces of evil, but the final battle is about to be fought. Then God will crush all opposition, evil will be destroyed, and his people will reign in glory. Revelation in the New Testament is a Christian apocalypse. Messianic hopes. The extravagant visions of the apocalypses expressed only one among a number of hopes cherished by Jews at that time. Several messianic figures from the Old Testament had gripped the popular imagination. The prophet like Moses, Deuteronomy 18:15-19. The returning Elijah, Malachi 4:5-6. But above all, the Son of David, a warrior king whose mission it would be to bring victory, peace and glory to Israel. Some thought of spiritual renewal, most of victory over the Romans. The word Messiah, Greek, is Christ, inevitably triggered hopes of political independence, so Jesus was cautious about letting others call him Christ. He came to a people looking for the consolation of Israel, as in Luke 2:25, but none expected it to come by way of a cross. Proselytes. Whilst Jews were often misunderstood and ridiculed, a considerable number of Gentiles were attracted to the Jewish religion and took the serious step of becoming proselytes. This involved circumcision and baptism, and the keeping of the whole law, including the Sabbath and food laws. It was in effect a change of nationality. Many more, attracted to the monotheistic faith and strict morality of Judaism, in contrast with the decadent polytheism of Rome, identified themselves with the faith and ideas of Israel, but stopped short of the proselytes' full commitment. These fellow travellers, often rich and influential officials, sometimes appear in the New Testament as those who fear God, or the devout. See Acts 13, chapters 26, 43 and 50. 17-4. That's Acts 13:26, 43, 50 and 17:4. The Samaritans. These were the descendants of the surviving Israelites of the northern kingdom, who intermarried with the newly imported alien population after the fall of Samaria in 722 BC. They never reintegrated with Judah. and by the time of Nehemiah the rift was irreparable. The building of the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim, overlooking Shechem, see John 4:20, set the seal on Jewish repudiation of the Samaritans. It was the Jewish king Hyrcanus who destroyed the Samaritan temple in 128 BC. Yet the Samaritans worshipped the same God. Their authority was the 5 books of Moses, but not the rest of the Old Testament. This fact hardly altered from the Jewish version. Like many of the Jews, they hoped for the coming of a prophet like Moses. Jewish hatred and disdain for the Samaritans sprang more from historical and racial considerations than from any fundamental difference of religion. Now to Jesus and the Old Testament. Jesus' Bible was the Old Testament. He quoted it frequently. At least 40 direct quotations are found in the Gospels, and more often referred indirectly to its stories and teaching. Some 70 clear allusions in the Gospels. His quotations often came with the simple but decisive introduction, "It is written." Sometimes he spoke more directly about its importance. Here are a few. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth. Until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law, until everything is accomplished." Matthew 5, verses 17 to 18. "Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." See Luke 24:44. And "the scripture cannot be broken." See John 10:35. Some of his harshest words were reserved for those who tried to evade the plain commands of God in the Old Testament by means of human traditions, however venerable. See Mark 7, verses 1 to 13. The authority of the Old Testament. In public controversy, Jesus regularly used a quotation from the Old Testament to settle the argument. See, for instance, Matthew 12, 3-4, 5-7, 21:13, 16, 22, 31-32, 43-44. It was an effective method, since other Jews also accepted the authority of the Old Testament. But this was no mere public stance to meet people on their own grounds. Even in private, the Old Testament was the basis of his life. When tempted in the wilderness, it was to the Old Testament that he turned for guidance. See Matthew 4, 4, 7, and 10. And even in his final agony on the cross, it was words from the Old Testament that he uttered. Mark 15:34, Luke 23:46, quoting Psalms 22:1 and 31:5. In teaching his disciples, Jesus was always using Old Testament language, sometimes by direct quotation, but often simply weaving familiar Old Testament words into his sayings. For instance, his mysterious prediction of future events in Matthew 24, 29-31 draws on no fewer than 7 Old Testament passages in just 3 verses. Isaiah 13:10, 34:4, Daniel 7:13, Zechariah 12:12, Isaiah 27:13, Deuteronomy 30:4, and Zechariah 2:6. Some of Jesus' most central ethical teaching comes directly from the law of Moses. See Matthew 19, 18-19, drawing on the 10 Commandments, and Matthew 22, 37-40, drawing on Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18. His Sermon on the Mount contains a striking sequence of examples where he examines Old Testament texts and themes and explains how they should be applied to practical Christian living. See Matthew 5:21-48. His complaint about other Jewish teachers was that they did not explore the full implications of these divine commands. Their superficial and wooden interpretations missed the point and prevented them from discovering the revealed will of God. The fulfillment of the Old Testament. Jesus came to fulfill the Old Testament, Matthew 5:17. In his teaching, we soon discover that this did not mean merely reinforcing its teaching. Indeed, sometimes he offered quite daring new insights, as, for example, his pronouncement that what goes into your mouth does not make you unclean, but what comes out of your mouth, that is what makes you unclean. Matthew 15:11. Contrast the food laws in Leviticus 11. It was more by his own life and supremely his death that he brought its fulfillment. So he often talked about his own role in the light of Old Testament models. As Jesus walked with 2 disciples after his resurrection, Luke tells us that, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said concerning himself in all the scriptures. See Luke 24:27. But this was merely the climax of the way he had been teaching them all through his ministry. Sometimes he referred to Old Testament people or events as foreshadowing his own life, e.g. Matthew 12, verses 40-42. Sometimes he quoted explicit predictions of one who was to come, Luke 4:17-21 and chapter 22:37. Again and again he insisted that he must suffer and die, because this was what had been written about him. We have Mark 8:31, 9:12-13, and Luke 18:31, Mark 14:21 and 27, Matthew 26:54, and Luke 24, verses 44-47. He had come to fulfill, and there was a divine compulsion about what was written. It must be fulfilled. The Old Testament was for Jesus not just a book of interesting historical records, but the authoritative word of God. He believed its statements, endorsed its teaching, obeyed its commands, and set himself to fulfill the pattern of redemption which it had laid down. His uncompromising acceptance of the Old Testament as the Word of God, that is, the Hebrew Bible, set the pattern for his followers, including the writers of the New Testament books, who delighted to trace the connections between Jesus and the Old Testament and fully shared his conviction of its authority. The Old Testament has rightly been described as the substructure of the New Testament theology. Without the Old Testament, you will never understand the New. Indeed, you will never make sense of Jesus. The Passover and the Last Supper. Written by a female Jewish Christian. Of all the Jewish festivals, Passover is the most important. See the great festivals. 8 days with no bread, cake, nothing with a raising agent in it, only matzah, flat, crisp slices of fairly tasteless, unleavened bread, all in memory of the great escape from Egypt. So swift there was no time for the daily homemade bread to rise. But at Passover there are compensations. The first night, Seder, meaning service, is a wonderful extended family celebration of the freedom God gives his people. It's a little like Christmas, except that the Seder has a long age-old liturgy, accompanied by a number of important symbolic rituals. This was almost certainly the setting for the Last Supper. Jesus used the rituals as a kind of audio-visual aid, so that in years to come, as they celebrated the Passover, his disciples would understand the full significance of the occasion. The service, which lasts about 4 hours and revolves around a slap-up meal, is contained in a book called the Haggadah, the Telling, recounting the story of how the Jews were delivered from slavery in Egypt and set out for the Promised Land. As a child, I had my own special edition with graphic illustrations of the 10 plagues and the drowning of the Egyptians in the Red Sea. The table today is resplendent with the best silver and crockery, glowing in the light of 2 traditional candles. In the farthest place, 3 squares of matzah are hidden in a satin holder. In the centre is the Seder dish, containing bitter herbs and 2 items added after the time of Christ, a burnt egg to symbolize the great temple which was destroyed, and the shank bone of a lamb, the only reminder of the lambs whose blood was used to daub the doorposts of the children of Israel at the time of the final plague in Egypt, so that the angel of death would pass them by. Every major festival is celebrated with red wine, the symbol of rejoicing, and on Seder night it is compulsory to drink 4 cups. After the traditional blessing, the first cup is drunk and the youngest child asks 4 questions. Basically, why is this night different from all the other nights? The rest of the service, by way of reply, tells the Exodus story. We were slaves in Egypt, and God heard our cry and came down and rescued us. No mention is ever made of Moses. An hour or so later, after singing Psalms 113 and 114, known as the small Hallel, praise, and a second cup of wine, when I was desperate with hunger, came that dreaded moment. Bitter herbs, usually eye-smarting pieces of horseradish root, dipped in charoseth, which is a sweet mixture of nuts, apples and wine, are distributed around the table and swallowed with a certain amount of groaning. They represent our ancestors' pain, made bearable only by the sweetness of the hope of the Promised Land. Everyone present says the Haggadah. Everyone present, says the Haggadah, should feel as if they had actually been a slave in Egypt. A special guest is given this delicacy first. Jesus offered it to Judas. The men washed their hands. This was probably the moment when Jesus washed the disciples' feet. And at last it's dinner time. Roast lamb at the time of Christ, but not today. The middle of the 3 matzahs has always been a special symbol of the Passover lamb. Earlier, the father has broken it in half, and whilst the children are distracted by the food, he hides it. Immediately after the meal, they search until they find it, then sell it back to the father, who breaks it and gives a piece to every guest. No more food must pass their lips that night. It would be impossible not to make the connection here with Jesus' institution of the communion, especially as it is followed by the 3rd cup, known as the cup of blessing. The cup of blessing, which we bless, is it not a sharing in the blood of Christ? Asks the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 10:16. The service continues with lots of joyous singing, including the Great Hallel, which is Psalm 136, and ends with the 4th cup, which is accompanied by a prayer to God to send your wrath on the nations that despise you. Jesus joined in the singing, then went out into the Garden of Gethsemane, see Matthew 26:30, and said, "Let this particular cup pass from me," before he yielded to the ordeal ahead. In other words, I am the Passover lamb broken for you, the blood shed for you. God's wrath will be poured on me, so that you are truly free. And to conclude then, with the briefest of introductions to the New Testament. The New Testament, like the Old, is a collection of books, 27 books and letters, written over a period of about 50 years in different styles by a number of authors. The Old Testament story covers a period of about 2,000 years, the New Testament story about 100, the 1st century AD, the time of the Roman Empire. The Old Testament tells the stories of many people, but essentially is the story of the nation of Israel. The New Testament focuses on one special person belonging to that same nation, Jesus Christ. The word testament means covenant or agreement. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is about the covenant between God and the people of Israel, the Jews. They were to be his special people, through whom the whole world would be blessed. In response to God's love and care, and to fulfill his purposes, they were to keep God's laws and be faithful to him. But time and again they failed, and so their prophets began to talk about a new covenant, one that people would keep because it would be written on their hearts by God himself, not something external, but a new life within. That new covenant, Christians believe, is what Jesus made possible through his life and death and resurrection. Through Jesus, God offers the gift of new life, a sharing in God's own life, now and forever. This special offer is not for one nation only, but for all the people of the world, all those willing to receive it. This new beginning for a sinful world will be completed when Christ returns, and all things are made new. That is why the Christian message is called Good News, a gospel. The first 4 books of the New Testament are called Gospels. They are 4 complementary accounts of the life of Jesus, each by a different writer with a particular purpose or angle related to those he was writing for. The Acts of the Apostles, which follows the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, is the second part of Luke's story, telling how Jesus' first followers spread the good news of what he had done out from Jerusalem and the province of Judea to the wider world of the Greek East and the Roman Empire. A key figure in this expansion is the Apostle Paul. He was not one of Jesus' original 12 disciples. In fact, he was fiercely opposed to what they were saying about Jesus and his resurrection, until a dramatic encounter with the risen Jesus completely changed his mindset and his life. After Acts come the letters. 13 of these have Paul's name attached to them. The rest are by other close followers of Jesus. Most are written to the new groups of Christians living in different places, answering questions, explaining more about what Jesus did, and showing them how to live out their new faith in practical ways. The last book in the New Testament is Revelation. It belongs to a special kind of writing called apocalyptic, and looks forward to the final triumph of God as an encouragement to believers when times are especially hard. Thank you. End of introduction to the New Testament.